Let's open to Exodus. We're now going to finally talk about Moses. And we're going to try to get our head around Moses. Moses is a great prophet, a great leader, and a symbolic entity in our world. When we talk about resonance, when we talk about things that go through us as people, Moses is not just a figure, but he's also a symbol. Harriet Tubman, I was telling you that Go Down Moses was a spiritual that was used as a warning. Harriet Tubman was called a Moses. She was a person who was raised with a very abusive slave master and escaped into the north, was freed, and with unbelievable courage used to turn around and sneak back into the South and help free slaves. I just can't believe that she had the courage to do that, having escaped. And she used to use spirituals as a way to guide people to know. They would say, have a little church gathering, and the song they chose to sing would let the slaves who were about to enter the Underground Railroad know whether it was safe to or not. Wade in the water was told them to go out and hide in the river. If a group started to sing Wade in the Water, they would know that there were pursuers nearby. The Steal Away to Jesus, they would sing a hymn called Steal Away to Jesus, and that meant that they were ready to go. When they sang Swing Low, Sweet Chariot, a band of angels are coming to take him to freedom. That means that the Underground Railroad, which is the chariot, is coming south. That means it's swinging low, and it's going to carry the slave home. This was one of her favorite songs, and she would sing it or have it sung. And slaves would know to get ready, just like the Exodus of old. They'd pack up and get ready to go. And finally, Go Down Moses, which I just had Louis Armstrong singing to us, would say it's not safe to come out. Pharaoh was nearby. So there's a Moses. Brigham Young is called the American Moses. Leaders who have a particular vision and who have been able to do something amazing, and especially who have led a people from one place to another, are called a Moses. So we're going to go down back to the real Moses, go down to Moses, and see what we can make of him. Let's open Exodus. I'll be reading against what you're reading. If you don't have my same translation, that's even better, because then we're going to hear two ways of saying the same thing. The book of Exodus just means to go out from. And the Hebrew name for this book means these are the names. And it's because it begins with these are the names. These are the names of the sons of Israel who came to Egypt with Jacob. So they set the scene for us, right? That 400 years before, we've had a jump of 400 years where there's Jacob comes finally with the 12 sons, everybody's reunited, and everybody settles in Egypt, where there is plenty. And pretty soon the children of Israel multiply in Egypt. They're there for several generations. And Moses is a member of what tribe, I'm not sure. He is an Israelite. He's born to a group of Israelites or Hebrews who have been enslaved. They weren't always enslaved when they were there. The theory is that the Hyksos dynasty, and I wrote it up so that you won't think I'm just sneezing, it's called Hyksos. And the Hyksos dynasty was a dynasty that existed for a while in Egypt where they were receptive to outside people. And that's how Joseph could have risen to be second in command under Pharaoh. In most of the Egyptian dynasties, he would not have been considered like a full human with the same rights as an Egyptian. But and so they think it must have been in the Hyksos dynasty when he was able to rise to power. Well, as the Hyksos get knocked out by a fellow named, let me see what I got his name here, something like Osmos or Amos. We get into what's called the New Kingdom. It's a new dynasty in Egypt, and it lasts about 400 years. And sometime during this dynasty, the Israelites get they're very plentiful, they're pretty powerful, and the Pharaoh begins to worry that they're too powerful. And so he comes up with a couple of, I think, a little unusual ways to decrease their power. A new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph, verse 8, and he said to his people, look, The Israelite people are much too numerous for us. Let us deal shrewdly with them. But one gets the feeling as we go along with this Pharaoh that shrewd is maybe not exactly the way you would describe him. So that they may not increase. Otherwise, in the event of war, they may join our enemies and fight against us and rise from the ground. So they set taskmasters over them to oppress them with forced labor. Now, forced labor is called corvée, and big groups of forced laborers existed in Egypt throughout their history. That's how they built the pyramids. It wasn't just the Israelites, but they would enslave different groups that they had captured. And so that form of slavery is a little different than just like flat out slavery, because apparently they still owned their homes. There's a part a little bit later in our story where they say, go and borrow from your neighbors, go and borrow from your Egyptian neighbors all their jewels, because you're going to take them with you. And they also talk about having boarders in their homes. So apparently they did continue to have a few things, property rights, a few things going on, but they were in these big forced labor gangs, and that's how the pyramids were constructed. It was not a fun life. I have a little thing called the Satire on the Trades that was written, and it was written at a time right during this time by an Egyptian who was trying to persuade his children to, just as we do, to go to college and get a job where he didn't have to do manual labor. And so he says this, I will describe to you the brickmaker, and that's what it is described in here that the Hebrews were set to doing. We're making the bricks that built the pyramids. His loins give him pain. Though he is out in the wind, he works without a cloak. His arms are spent from exertion, and having mixed all kinds of dirt all day, when he eats bread with his fingers, he washes them at the same time. So there, it's just kind of it's supposed to be sort of a humorous poem, but at the same time, very seriously, gives us a description of what their life was like. I think we ended up with the Cecil B. DeMille movie getting a pretty accurate vision of, I mean, it comes pretty close to what the Bible is like. So the king of Egypt in verse 15, after they had ruthlessly imposed on them all sorts of forced labor and beat them, there also is an actual illustration from, like on the wall of one of the insides of the pyramids, showing that the brickmakers making the bricks for the pyramids. They show a group standing in the water, mixing up the mud. Then they show a group mixing mud with straw. They show someone measuring them so that they all come out even, so that you get that nice triangle. And then they show a taskmaster with a rod, and underneath it says, I have the rod in my hand. So the description we have here is attested to by the few historical things that exist. Verse 15, the king of Egypt spoke to the Hebrew midwives. There appear to just be two that he's speaking to, one of whom was named Shiphrah and the other Puah, saying, when you deliver the Hebrew women, look at the birth stool. If it is a boy, kill him. If it is a girl, let her live. It is interesting that we're not given the name of the Pharaoh that Moses stands before, but we are given the name of the two midwives, because they're the really important people. And it's interesting also to watch how many women surround Moses. A woman is responsible for almost every really important thing that happens to him. And women chronicle what happens to him, and his life is circumscribed by these tremendous women who save him. So the midwives feared God, right? And they did not do as the king of Egypt had told them, so they let the boys live. So the king of Egypt summoned the midwives and said to them, why have you done this thing and let the boys live? And the midwives, craftily, this is chapter 1, verse 19, said, because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, they're vigorous. Before the midwife can get to them, they have given birth. Sorry, baby was already here, we didn't see it. And God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and increased greatly. So here you have another interesting thing about Exodus and these books in the Pentateuch, which is numbers. Okay, if there's like 1 million slaves that go out from Egypt, or 600,000 men, or however many they say later, and there's 2 midwives, this just seems a little off. our good Old Testament manual from the seminary gives a really interesting point, which they say that if you just move one thing, a little dot, that the early translators thought meant thousands and really may just be a dot. Every time it like says 59,000 people, it could actually just be 59 people, or it might be 590 people. So the numbers may be a little off. And once again, remember that we have a story here. We don't want to let the boring numbers get in the way of the impact of the story when we're telling it to our children to get them to understand the power of God. So just as Laban says to his daughter, you know, may you be the mother of millions, you know, he doesn't mean that exactly. What he means that you will be the head of a great family or a dynasty. So as we hit the numbers later, let's keep in mind that the numbers are quite fluid. So the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women. God dealt well with the midwives, and the people continued to increase. And because the midwives feared God, he established households for them. Then Pharaoh charged all his people, saying, every boy that is born you shall throw into the Nile, but let every girl live. A certain man of the house of Levi went and married a Levite woman. So there, Moses was a Levite. I should have known that. The woman conceived and bore a son, and when she saw how beautiful he was, she hid him for 3 months. And when she could hide him no longer, she got a wicker basket for him and caulked it with bitumen and pitch. She put the child into it and placed it among the reeds by the bank of the Nile. Why do you think they threw in that little detail about caulking it with bitumen and pitch? Anywhere else pitch turns up in the Old Testament? They caulk something so it doesn't sink in the water? The ark. It's an ark. So we have Moses has connections that go back and forth and forward and back. Once again, as good Hebrew children, when we listen to this story, it's supposed to resonate with everything else that our parents have told us. And as adults, when we listen to the story, it's supposed to resonate with everything else. We're supposed to think of Noah being saved in the ark. Now, why would we need to think of Noah? What does Moses have to do with Noah? I'm a little Hebrew kid, and I'm saying, Mom, why am I supposed to think about Noah? What does Moses have to do with Noah? Yeah, and there was water, right? Huh? Yes. Idle. Huh? Yes, that they were saved by water, weren't they? Noah and his family were saved by water. And Moses was saved by water. And the Israelites, stay tuned, spoiler alert, are going to be saved right in the middle of the Red Sea, right in the place that Noah floated on. So let's read on. Whenever we hear something that strikes us as familiar, we've heard it somewhere else, it's interesting to go back and think about the story. Well, what are the parallels? What are the symbols? Laura and I had great experience last night, and our son Kirk, we went and saw Benedict Cumberbatch do Hamlet in, the Fathom events where they take the actual theater production and they film it live and you get to go see it. Well, we were pretty excited about this, and it really was everything we'd hoped. It was an amazing experience, but Hamlet is so, I said to Kirk, it's like listening to an album of greatest hits. It's just like every line they say practically refers to something else. And by this time, about 25 things that he says are titles of books or titles of movies. There's so much interaction between almost everything that is said in the play and everything else you've ever read or heard. At the end, Kirk said, I have a whole list of things I have to go home and reread just because it's mentioned, all of these things. As we were talking about it later, as we were talking about it afterward, I thought one of the most interesting things about the evening was that right before the production of Hamlet started, they interviewed Benedict Cumberbatch about playing Hamlet, which is, of course, probably the most difficult thing ever to do. And it's, I think, one of the longest, well, it's certainly the longest part in Shakespeare and maybe one of the biggest roles ever. Just the amount of words that you have to learn is so amazing. And the interviewer said to him, how do you give the to be or not to be speech? I mean, everyone has heard it a million times. They all know it by heart. They're going to be sitting there reciting along with you. how do you even think about how to give that speech? And I'm not paraphrasing him well, but essentially Benedict said the point is you have to say it like you just thought of it. And otherwise, it will sound trite. And this particular story is created in such a way, and it was funny, as at the end we were sitting there still just talking about everything, and this one couple came out, and the lady looked over at me and she said, Ophelia still died. I said, well, come back next time. Maybe it'll end better, you know. And how great is that we sat there for 3 hours and 15 minutes and we're still crushed at the things that happened. And if there's a piece of literature I know well, that's probably one of them that I know the very best. And I'm still just holding my breath every time anything happens. I'm hoping against hope that the things don't happen that are going to happen. That's the way this story is constructed. So that a Hebrew child, year after year, when the Passover feast is held, hears the story of the plagues and how Pharaoh continues to harden his heart. And then God gets in there and hardens his heart. And it's repeated 20 times, all told. All of this heart hardening. And the children have been thinking, you know, oh, he won't get to the place where all the kids get killed, will he? I mean, he just won't go that far, will he? And yes, he will. And so this dramatic tension that builds partially by the story itself, by the events, but it's also constructed to build so that it never gets old. So as we read, we get this feeling of the beautiful, masterful construction of this story. And one of the things is that it begins with an ark in the water, and it ends by being saved in the water, right in the water. They're standing with walls of water on either side of them. So there's a nice symmetry to that. So she pulls this kid in and raises him. And now the next question that comes to my mind is, how does she raise Moses? And the Pharaoh doesn't notice. But one of our commentaries mentioned that the Pharaoh would have had many, many, many wives and concubines who were raising many, many, many children. And he would have been raised maybe not even in that palace, but in one of the palaces of Pharaoh. And he would have been raised in privilege and been well educated, but not necessarily. That's where Cecil B. DeMille may have let us off, because we thought he was like best friends with Yul Brynner for the whole time. And so it's, you know, he may have not really been like right under Pharaoh's mighty nose. When the daughter of Pharaoh came down to bed, oh, we got the sister. So the mom takes him down and hides him. We're in chapter 2. And his sister stationed herself at a distance to learn what would befall him. And the daughter of Pharaoh came down. So there's 3 women that are responsible for his salvation. The daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe in the Nile while her maidens walked along the Nile. She spied the basket among the reeds and sent her slave girl to fetch it. When she opened it, she saw that it was a child, a boy, crying. She took pity on it and said, this must be a Hebrew child. And so then his sister Miriam shows up and says, shall I go get you a nurse to suckle the child? And Pharaoh's daughter says, well, sure, how fun that you just happen to be standing here. So the girl went and called the child's mother. And so Pharaoh's daughter said to her, will you please take this child and nurse it for me, and I will pay you. So how great would that be if someone showed up at your house and paid you for the baby you were already nursing? We all should be so lucky. So the woman took the child and nursed it. And when the child grew up, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, who made him her son. Grew up possibly when he was weaned, possibly when he was whatever age they considered was acceptable, the way they would start. And this tradition goes all the way down through, you know, you have King Arthur's time where wards would come in, right? And would be sent to other homes to live, even to the homes of people that you had even fought in a war. You would send a son away to be raised in somebody else's house because it would make him stronger and give him experiences. And so this was not an uncommon thing. She brings him back, names him Moses. And Moses is a name that sounds Egyptian, like Ramses, Moses, right? But it also sounds a little bit Hebrew too. It's one of those kinds of ones in the middle. And it happens to mean I drew him out of the water. So sometime after that, when Moses had grown up, he went out to his kinsfolk and witnessed their labors. He knows they're his cousins, although he doesn't live with them. He knows they are his kin. He turned this way and that. Oh, well, wait a minute. He saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his kinsmen. So he felt the kinship to this Hebrew. So he turned this way and that. He looks around. This is premeditated. He turned this way and that. And seeing nobody about, he struck down the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. So this is the first thing that we really learn about Moses. That's kind of an interesting sort of first experience with this prophet that we're going to know about. And it sort of says to me that he's got a little ways to go before he's ready to lead the Egyptians. You know, he starts out a little on the off side. People used to criticize Joseph Smith because he was a money digger, because he went around with people who were seeking treasure. How could that person ever become a prophet? Well, he wasn't hiding any Egyptians in the sand. So apparently God takes weak people who make mistakes and who don't always have a perfect vision, and that's the clay he starts with to build these great men. So he buries this guy in the sand. When he went out the next day, he found two Hebrews fighting. So he says to the offender, "Why do you strike your fellow?" And the Hebrew says back, "Who makes you the chief and ruler over us? Do you mean to kill me as you killed the Egyptian?" So they're not even grateful. And he gets that they know. And so he's frightened and thought, then the matter is known. When Pharaoh learned of the matter, he sought to kill Moses. But Moses fled from Pharaoh. He arrived in the land of Midian, and he sat down behind a well. Any other Midianites come to mind? We ever heard of them before? Maybe a caravan of them who happened by, somebody in a pit? Joseph. Midianites. And so here goes, so we think about Joseph. Now we have a Pharaoh who knows not Joseph, and all of a sudden Moses has gone all the way back to where Joseph started. So he goes back to Midian. And what does he do when he gets to Midian? He goes to we know all about the wells. As soon as we get to a well, what are we going to find? A woman. We're going to get a wife. It's like, talk about the watering hole. This is it. Go to the well and get a wife. Now the priest of Midian had 7 daughters, not just one. They came to draw water and filled the troughs to water their father's flocks. And in the Cecil B. DeMille movie, they dance. But shepherds came and drove them off. Moses rose to their defense and he watered their flock. When they returned to their father Reuel, he said, "How is it that you're home so early?" And they said, "An Egyptian rescued us from the shepherds." He's an Egyptian, they think. "He even drew water for us and watered the flock." He said to his daughters, of whom he had 7, but he had to marry off, "Well, where is he? Why did you leave the man? Why did you bring him home? Ask him to break bread." Moses consented to stay with the man, and he gave Moses his daughter Zipporah as his wife. She bore a son whom he named Gershom, for he said, "I have been a stranger in a strange land." So we've now taken Moses. There's a tradition that says, and in fact it's a scriptural tradition, somebody, maybe Stephen in the New Testament, says that Moses was 40 when he went to Midian, and that he lives in Midian 40 years, and he's 80 when he has the vision of the bush, and he's 120 when he dies. So they do it in 40s. Once again, if they're doing it in 40s, we're not absolutely sure that we believe the number. But if we were totally believing the numbers, he's 80 years old when we get to chapter 3. Now Moses, tending the flock of his father-in-law, gets to this. Here's Mount Sinai. One thing in the Bible that is a little confusing is that as you know, these are records that have been brought together and then by some inspired redactor put all together. And there's one author who will call it Horeb and one who will call it Sinai. And the one who calls it Horeb also always refers to God as Elohim. And the one who calls it Sinai always refers to God as Yahweh, which translated in your King James Version is Lord, all in little tiny capital letters, right? And if you wonder how we got Jehovah, do you want me to stop and tell you real quick? Okay, so the Germans, when they translated the Bible, took Yahweh, and then they took the word Adonai, because Jews won't say Yahweh. They won't even say Yahweh, because they won't pronounce the name of the Lord, and they won't put the consonants in and pronounce it. So when the Jews read the Bible, they say Adonai, which means my Lord. And so the Germans took those 3 vowels and put them in between the Yahweh consonants, and it came out Yehovah. How do you like that? So we get Jehovah from the Germans, Adonai from the Jews, Yahweh from the written text, which they don't say out loud. And in fact, there was one sect of the Jews that was so strict that the only time they would ever say the Lord's name was on the one day of the year, at the Day of Atonement, when the priest went in, and he would say it once in the Holy of Holies, and when he said it, the choir would swell so that no one else could hear it but God. And so they do take things all the way there. And this is a lot of what Jesus had to say. You know, you are spending all of this effort about how sacred the name of God is, but you've lost. You don't really care about trying to reach him. You care more about, as Jesus said, putting a hedge around things. Here we are in chapter 3. Moses, tending the flock of his father-in-law, the priest of Midian, drove the flock into the wilderness, came to Horeb, so we get, this guy calls it Horeb, the mountain of God. An angel of the Lord appeared to him in a blazing fire out of a bush. He gazed, and there was a bush all aflame, yet the bush was never consumed. Moses said, I must turn aside to look at this marvelous sight. Why doesn't the bush burn up? And when the Lord God saw that he had turned aside, he called to him out of the bush and said, Moses, Moses. Here's the famous answer, here I am. We can go back and find all of the places the prophets say that. And he said, do not come closer. Remove your sandals from your feet, for the place whereon you stand is holy ground. And this was an old tradition that if you went into any kind of a sacred space, you would remove your shoes. And it continues even to cultures like the Japanese, for whom, because the home is a sacred place, we remove our shoes. You would never step into a home with your shoes on. Do not come closer. Remove your sandals. The place is a holy ground. I am, he said, the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. So God identifies himself as the God who his ancestors have worshipped. And the Lord continued, I have marked well the plight of my people in Egypt, and have heeded their outcry because of their taskmasters. Yes, I'm mindful of their sufferings. I have come down to rescue them from the Egyptians and to bring them out of the land to a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey, the region of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites, which is a little warning of how many people you're going to have to drive out of there, but I don't know if he thought about that right that minute. Now the cry of the Israelites has reached me. Moreover, I have seen how the Egyptians oppress them. Come therefore, and I will send you to Pharaoh, and you shall free my people, the Israelites, from Egypt. Now, we're back to the journey of the hero, aren't we? Where we have the hero who is called by God in a special way to come out of his homeland. He came out of his homeland. He's in Midianites. He's called by God. And what does the hero always do first? He refuses. He refuses 4 different ways. But Moses said to God, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and free the Israelites from Egypt? I mean, I was only raised in the house of Pharaoh. I'm like the only Hebrew around who could probably do this, but I don't want you to notice that. I'm just telling you I can't do it. And God says, I'll be with you. That shall be your sign. It was I who sent you. And when you have freed the people from Egypt, you will worship God at this mountain. You're coming back here, he says. Moses said to God, when I come to the Israelites and I say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they ask me, what is his name? What shall I say to them? And God said to Moses, Eyeh Asher Eyeh. This is what is written in my Hebrew Bible. And the reason why it is written this way in my Hebrew Bible, I think, is because God's proper name, it says, disclosed in the next verse, Yahweh, Yod He Vav. In Hebrew, in ancient times, the Vav was pronounced W, but here God first tells Moses, Eyeh Asher Eyeh, which is best translated as, I will be what I will be, meaning my nature will become evident from my actions. I think that's very interesting. You know, we've heard lots of different translations, but I really kind of love that translation right there, and it makes me think about a lot of things. He continued, thus shall you say to the Israelites, Eyeh, or I am, sent me to you. And God said further to Moses, thus shall you speak to the Israelites, the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, has sent me to you. And so he says, get the elders of Israel together, and Moses just keeps objecting. He says, well, they're not going to believe me, and they're not going to listen to me. What shall I say? And so God in chapter 4 says, what's that in your hand? And he says, it's a rod. And he said, cast it on the ground. So he cast it on the ground. It became a snake, and Moses recoiled from it. And the Lord said to Moses, put out your hand and grasp it by the tail. So he grabbed it by the tail, became a rod in his hand. He said, that they may believe that I did appear to you. And then he's put your hand in the bosom, and he brings it out, it's withered, he puts it back, it's healed. So he's showing him miracles right there while he's standing there. And he says the water's going to turn to blood. All of these things are going to happen. And amazingly, Moses still comes up with another objection. He says, I'm slow of speech. I've never been a good public speaker. I'm terrified of it. And he says, well, who gives man speech? Who makes him dumb or deaf or blind? Is it not I, the Lord? Now go, and I'll be with you as you speak and instruct you to say. In verse 13, he says, but please, O Lord, make someone else your agent. So this is 4 things now. And the Lord became angry with Moses, and he said, well, there's your brother Aaron the Levite. He, I know, speaks readily. Even now he's setting out to meet you, and he'll be happy to see you. You shall speak to him and put the words in his mouth, and I will be with you. So he sends his brother. There's this negotiation going on. It's a marvelous thing. So Moses goes back to his father-in-law and says, I'm going to go back to my kinsman. And he says, go in peace. And he doesn't really tell him about this big vision. Well, having gotten this far, we've got Moses called. He's objected every way he could think of. We now think to ourselves, or at least I think to myself, how does the guy that buried the Egyptian in the sand become the man who becomes a savior to a whole people? What change? I mean, he's just been tending sheep. What change occurs to him that makes him so ready? And I'd like you to open to Moses in the Pearl of Great Price.
Hey, Marilyn, you know, he was just wrestling with the Lord right there. I mean, he was...
Yes, same thing, like Jacob. I should have said something. Yeah, there's another resonance there where he argues back and forth. And the whole business of names. Remember how Jacob says to God, tell me your name.
No, I didn't know that.
Yeah, he says, tell me your name. And he says, well, I'm not going to tell you my name, but I'll give you a new one. And he names him Israel. And so this whole business of names, we go back to Adam, who names the animals. There's a real strong belief that to name something is to have dominion over it. And to know the name of God. The name of God is a big thing with the Jews. To know the name of God, to say the name of God carries its own power. That it would, like, you'd die if you said the name of God. Yes, Jean.
Modern day Jews, it's blasphemous to say Elohim out loud.
Yes, for modern day Jews, they don't say, and they do not say Yahweh. And Christians have begun to use the name Yahweh. They've begun to use it in their scriptures, and they've begun to use it in their prayers a lot. Evangelical Christians in particular use the name Yahweh a lot. And the Jewish commentators say, you would never hear a Jew say that. They don't say those names. They say, my Lord or Adonai. Michael.
Just one other note, when
Turn around so everybody can hear you. Zach.
Moses killed the Egyptian and buried him, and then was called to test by the Hebrews. In Acts, it makes reference to the fact that he made an excuse saying, here I am trying to help you, and you're mad at me. So the very first thing he ever did to try and help the Hebrews, they were upset with him.
They're already mad.
Yeah, and so now he's
it
already
never
kind of
ends.
got that in the back of his head.
That's true. You know, that is interesting. About that, but what Michael said, in case you didn't hear him, and this is my brother Michael, who's here today, and he knows everything, and he knows everything, and I know everything else. So Moses with the Hebrew, the only experience he's really had is that nobody thanked him for killing the Egyptian that was trying to kill the Hebrew. They were going to tell on him. So he thinks, why would I go back and help those people? They're not that fun. So let's talk just a little bit of, yes?
I was just thinking on that same line that he was doing what he did of rulers. People were more disposable. They were not as high up as he was. And that's how he was raised. So he doesn't have the same vision of everyone being equal and important to God yet.
So Moses think of people equally. He's been raised in a privileged environment. And so why not dispose of an Egyptian taskmaster? I mean, they're bad. And he would consider himself privileged in that way. I think that is so interesting. He's having to sort of rethink everything, isn't he? And it's not always easy. Yes, anybody else have a comment or two about where we are with Moses right now? Now, have you got a Pearl of Great Price with you? If you have a phone, you probably figured out. And I just want to talk about this for a second, but I really think if you want to get Exodus, you need to read chapter 1 of Moses, because this beautiful passage, and this, I've had it in my mind so much as we've come toward this class, this beautiful passage to me is one of the most beautiful passages in all of the scriptures. This happens right at this point. We ask ourselves, what happens to Moses when he has this vision of God? So he sees God, he says he sees God face to face. He talked with him and the glory of God was on Moses. And he could endure his presence. God spoke to him and tells him, I am the Almighty, I am endless is my name. And then he says, thou art my son, wherefore look, and I will show thee the workmanship of my hands. And then he goes on to a really long explanation about nobody could see all of the works of God and still remain in the flesh. You can't know everything about me and still stay on the earth. But, he says in verse 7, and now behold, this one thing I will show unto thee, Moses, my son, for thou art in the world, and now I show it unto thee. I thought, if I had a prayer that I was going to pray to Heavenly Father, that would be a good one. Heavenly Father, could you show me my world the way you see it, as opposed to the way I see it? Could you give me a vision of my little world that I live in? Could you show me what you see as opposed to what I see? So Moses looks and he beholds the world upon which he's created. I can't help but think of, I always think when people have big discussions about God and the Trinity and all that kind of stuff, I just have a mental vision in my head of 2 fleas on the back of a dog, having a big argument about what breed the dog is. And it's just like we're like this small. We can't see. We know we're on a dog. It smells like a dog. It's, we're on a dog. We're riding along. But we can't see. We could be on a poodle. We could be on a mastiff. But he gets to see. He sees the world upon which he was created. And Moses beheld the world and the ends thereof, and all the children of men which were created, and of the same he greatly marveled and wondered. And the presence of God, I'm in Moses 1 and 9, withdrew from Moses, that his glory was not upon Moses. And Moses was left unto himself. And as he was left unto himself, he fell to the earth. And it came to pass that it was for the space of many hours before Moses did again receive his natural strength like unto man. And he said unto himself, now for this cause I know that man is nothing, which thing I never had supposed. But mine own eyes had beheld God, and he says, now I've seen God. So man is nothing, which thing I never had supposed. And the minute this happens, right, in verse 12, who comes along? Satan came tempting him, saying, Moses, worship me. Well, you'd think, he just found out he was nothing. You'd think that there'd be no way he could fight against Satan. What's going on here? I mean, he knows he's nothing. He's nothing. But he stands right up and says, who are you? Who art thou? For behold, I am a son of God, in the similitude of his only begotten. And where is thy glory, that I should worship thee? And he says, I couldn't even look upon God, I would have died, but now he has not withdrawn his glory from me altogether. Blessed be the name of my God, for his spirit hath not altogether withdrawn from me, or else where is thy glory? For it is darkness unto me, and I can judge between thee and God. For God said unto me, worship God, for him only shalt thou serve. Get thee hence, Satan, deceive me not. For God said unto me, thou art after the similitude of mine only begotten Son. And then he says, I will not cease to call upon God, for I have a lot more stuff to ask him. I love that. So here's 2 things. I'm nothing, which thing I had never supposed. I saw the whole world. I saw God. I'd die if I was in his presence. I'm a tiny little nothing. On the other hand, when Satan comes along, I'm telling him I'm a son of God. How do those 2 things work together? I mean, how do we communicate? Those 2 things seem to be opposite. Do you have any comments about this, Joy?
We're divine in nature, and we are to be humble. Both of those things, being divine in nature
It's big, but being humble is that tiny end.
Yeah, it's an interesting balance. I mean,
I don't see it as an opposite, I see it as a continuum. So God is here, and we are here. So compared to God, we are nothing, but then Satan is way over here. On the other
okay, I like this. I'm going to do your continuum. Here's me, little nothing. And here's God, and I'm moving on a continuum toward light and greatness and glory, or away from light and greatness and glory.
So we know enough of our worth to know that we are still children of God, even though we're nothing.
Yes, we know enough of our worth to know that we're children of God. I like this, but we're still nothing. Michael. But you have to turn around because like 90%.
So Moses recognizes that he still has the Spirit of God in him, a portion of the Spirit. He is nothing without the Spirit of God. And Satan does not have that Spirit, and he can see the difference. So he knows the difference between good and evil.
Who? Moses knows the
Moses.
difference? Oh,
Moses
Satan
does.
doesn't have the spirit to
Satan does
discern.
not have any spirit that Moses can recognize.
Oh,
So he sees that
there's no light there.
there's no light.
Yeah.
But even though he recognizes he is nothing without the Spirit of God.
But he's got that.
But he's got that,
Yeah.
therefore he can discern the difference between him.
I love that.
Have a comment? Yes, Renee.
We sometimes say, the muse came to me, you know, so it's when you say, this isn't my idea, this isn't about me, this is about God. So I think he's emptying out his naturalness and saying, now I'm going to be God's mold.
That's fantastic. Val.
I was just thinking and teaching Sunday's lessons to little kids about the brother Jared too, having almost a similar experience, but kind of reacting a little differently than Moses, but we don't know exactly everything that happened. But Moses, because we don't know who wrote this, didn't really talk about the form of God. And, you know, brother Jared was having a similar experience, but was just blown away by the similarities and how much we were like God in physicality and everything about, but he doesn't record, he says, everything that happens, but he gets the preview.
Yeah.
He gets to see the world as, you know, God gives him that vision, and his reaction seemed kind of different than Moses' reaction, and even their leadership roles seemed really different.
Yeah.
Almost
And that's
the same.
cool too, because they're different people. So
Yeah.
Val's saying that the brother of Jared, we should go back and study that experience again. But several of the same components, yes.
I don't know about you guys, but anytime I have one of those experiences where I'm getting a direct answer to prayer.
Here, stand up.
Oh goodness, okay.
That's right. Just because we want Elizabeth to hear you.
Any of those times when, I don't know if you've had, I'm sure you had these experiences where you get a direct, very direct, clear answer to prayer. It feels that way to me, where I see the glory of God and I feel my own nothingness, and there's no reason to cry, so let's get the camera. But that's my experience, where it is exactly that. God is everything. I am nothing. The adversary has nothing to do with me because I am on the right path.
And that's one of the great paradoxes of life. And I really do think that the whole history of the world starts with a paradox, right? It starts, and by this I do not mean two physicians. It starts with a paradox. It has the idea where you
need to keep a commandment, and the idea you need to keep this other commandment. In order to keep this other commandment, you have to break this commandment. And God just seems to do that always. And part of the thing that I think is what he's trying to teach us is that, like he said, you can't get my ways. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you these things that seem totally opposite, and what Joseph Smith called the Spirit of God comes in proving contraries, where these things seem contrary and yet you see how they come together. And at the time when we feel the Spirit of God the most, we feel the most humble. We feel the most totally in need of God's Spirit. And we feel the most powerful. We feel that we don't fear anything because we have that light. Like Michael said, we can discern, we can see. How this translates into our everyday life, I think, is what's important. How it translated into Moses' life, we talked about who Pharaoh was, but he goes back, and this is Charlton Heston right here. And he goes back and he talks to Pharaoh and says, you need to let my people go. And they go through this whole thing of 10 plagues. They get worse and worse and worse. And the Passover supper, the Seder that the Jews do now, is a commemoration of these plagues and how it all builds toward the night when the firstborn of the Egyptians all die, harking right back symmetrically in the story to Pharaoh trying to kill the male sons. Here we go, the firstborn heirs of the Egyptian all die. And then the Lord, the angel of death, passes over the houses where the blood of the lamb is spread. So, of course, Moses as a type of Christ is very strong here, but also the Passover as a prefiguration of the sacrament is part of this too. And in fact, the sacred feast is worth thinking about. And I promised I would say a little something about the pilgrims. I'm learning about the pilgrims a little bit, and they were real Old Testament types, and they saw their role. They had a great leader, and they saw Bradford, their great leader, as a Moses who led them across, and they gave a big feast that was based basically on the Jewish feast of the is it Sukkot, the thing where the booths in the fall, where they would set up the booths, and they did a great festival feast to thank God for saving them. Now, when they gave the first Thanksgiving, they actually read an edict, and they said in the edict that like William Bradford, who was their leader, like Moses had led them there, they had survived by the grace of God, and that this feast was to commemorate the power of God in their lives. And when Thanksgiving was first inaugurated or made into a holiday, this was what was said: whereas it is the duty of all nations to acknowledge the providence of Almighty God, to obey His will, to be grateful for His benefits, and humbly to implore His protection and favor, whereas both houses of Congress have by their joint committee requested me, said the President, to recommend to the people of the United States a day of public thanksgiving and prayer, to be observed by acknowledging with grateful hearts the many and signal favors of the Almighty God, especially by affording them an opportunity to be peaceably established in a form of government for their safety and happiness. So as we come to the end of a very tumultuous year and we have Thanksgiving, I think something that we have to be thankful for and that we really need to teach our families is that Thanksgiving is not a secular holiday. It was originated as a religious holiday, a feast, a festal sacrament where we thank God. And I think this just is kind of an important part of it. So that's one thing about our feasts. We have the sacrament, we have other feasts. And when we take the sacrament on Sunday, it's like a Thanksgiving feast, is what we could think of it. Rather than always just thinking about our sins, I think it's a wonderful thing to think of it as a little Thanksgiving, where we could just sit and be grateful for all of our many blessings. That's one thing that I wanted to bring up that Moses kind of speaks to me about. And the other thing, so this is our little pilgrims, and the other thing that I sort of was thinking about was the plagues and the miracles and all those kinds of things. On what is our testimony based? Is it based on the time we lost our car keys and we prayed and we found them? A lot of that is really important because my car keys seem to have a mind of their own. Or as this good sister shared with us, those moments when we really feel the Spirit of God, are we making sure that our children and those people that we love and teach have something to be thankful for? Jedediah M. Grant once said, in the gospel, we know the difference between the history of the feast and the feast itself. So the gospel itself is a feast, and it's a feast when we feel the Holy Spirit. It's a feast when we feel the Spirit. And when we feel the Spirit, we feel all filled up and we have that feast. And otherwise, we're just talking about stuff. We're just talking about rules, regulations, good ideas, helpful thoughts. And that's not real when things get really hard. That's not the angel of death passing over your house. So most of us have maybe half a dozen, would you have? Seminal experiences in your life that make up your testimony. Think about it for a second. What do you got? You got a few of them, right? I mean, there's all the everyday things, but then there's those moments when there's those moments. You know, when the Spirit just spoke in your heart and said, bam. And as Alma said, is this not real? Is this not real? When you feel that, that's real. And one thing that I thought might be a thing to do as we come to Thanksgiving this year is make sure that the people we love know those things about us. We do not doubt our mothers knew it, the stripling warriors said. We'll go face death. We have no doubt in our minds that our mothers knew it. Whether the orange rolls were perfect, whether the gravy was smooth, whether the cranberry sauce was properly made, not that stuff you buy in a can, or the stuff you buy in a can because it tastes so much better than the stuff that's properly made, however you feel about it. Matters less than our children knowing what we know. And so as this day of Thanksgiving approaches, I give my thanks to Heavenly Father for that incredible feeling that I have that I am not alone. That at the times when I feel the lowest, I feel His Spirit. And at very unusual moments, I just have, as many of you do, as all of you do, or you wouldn't be here today. You just have something come into your heart that says something to you, or whispers to you, or says this person needs you, or that person, here's what to say. And most especially, I think that feeling that we have when we feel a little lost, that we have that Spirit of the Lord that says, just wait on me. Just wait on me a little bit. And it will come to you, what we need to do. And you'll be aware of it. It will all come right. I've been very touched this week. We may talk about it later again, but if you haven't read Michael McLean's story in LDS Living this week, it touched me so much because he told the story of hitting a crisis in faith when his son came home from his mission, knew he was gay, decided if he just prayed and prayed and prayed and prayed and prayed, maybe it would go away, and got to the point where he was suicidal. Finally came to his father and said, I can't go on any further. And this was right at the time when everybody was out campaigning for Proposition 8. And Michael McLean, who considers himself sort of the troubadour for the church, said, I'm singing to everyone, you're not alone. He said, but I felt alone. I couldn't feel anything. I couldn't get the Spirit. I felt that just like these two things, they were so far apart. How could I reconcile the feelings I had for my son and wanting to support him and wanting to be a faithful member of the church and the policy that I couldn't feel good about? And he just couldn't get there. And I was inspired by the choice he made, which was to wait on the Lord. He decided he would just continue going to church, continue trying to be faithful. And one night he had a dream, and he had a dream about Mother Teresa. And in the dream, Mother Teresa he wrote a song for her, of course, this being Michael McLean. And in the dream, she sang, he had read a book about her, and she had a huge crisis of faith with the Catholic Church that we don't know about, that for her lasted 49 years, where she had a disagreement with the way things were done, and yet she felt like, should I go or should I stay? Should I continue? What should I do? And so for 49 years, she waited on the Lord. And in this dream, she's saying, I pray to a God I cannot hear. I live by a truth that I know I don't feel it right now. And when he woke up, he thought, I can wait on the Lord. I can wait on the Lord. I can just wait on the Lord. And how the answer came to him was the way God speaks to him, as he speaks differently to all of us. But in one particular period of time, over a period of 10 days, he had songs just come into his mind and come into his mind and come into his mind. And all of those songs were about people in the New Testament time where people didn't know if to believe in Jesus or not. And just like John the Baptist, when he said, go and ask him if he's the Savior, Jesus' answer was, watch the things that I do, and then you decide. Watch what I do. And this reminded me of what the Hebrew translation says in the burning bush. My name is I am, or I will be, or you will know me through my actions. So my faith and prayer is that in any way that we feel lost or separated, or that a miracle is needed, let's not fall prey to the magic tricks that the world offers us that look like an easy truth. Let's wait on the Lord. Let's stay faithful. Let's be thankful for all of the light that we do have, and have trust and faith in Him that more light is coming. The miracles of the 10 plagues to me just say that a lot of really bad stuff happens when we are chasing that kind of proof. But when we step back and wait on the Lord and say, no, you don't have to prove everything to me. I'm going to be here. And with that faith, then I think those answers are going to come to us. That's what I believe. It's what I have faith in. I leave that in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.